I call Kevin Haig.
Thank you, Mr Chair, and I thank the Minister for his contribution and also take this opportunity to thank him for his gracious concession around the voting order for the Part 1 votes. The contribution is just made, and indeed that from the Honourable Annette King, offer quite a good point of departure for me, because the first set of points I want to make about Part 2, and mindful of the time, these may be the only ones before the dinner break, are around the fact that we have some incoherence in our New Zealand law. So we have different, I mean, there is a range, Mr Chair, of substances that people consume because it's fun to do so, or they derive some personal benefit or utility from doing so, but which pose some risk of harm to them. And there are the substances that are regulated under the Misuse of Drugs Act. There is alcohol, which is regulated under a separate statute. And there's tobacco, which is, again, has a separate and different regulatory regime. And we're actually adding, in this bill, a fourth strand. So for this to be a useful addition, I think one of the characteristics that we need to look for is a way forward for converging those various strands into a single rational regulatory framework. And I'm very pleased to say, and I think there's probably violent agreement around the House on this, that this bill actually does provide a path forward for that convergence. And to that end, Mr Chair, we've taken, I guess, provisions from certainly from the tobacco framework and from the alcohol framework, and pulled them into this bill. And indeed, there could potentially be elements of the Misuse of Drugs Act, although, in fact, I think there are even elements of that Act that we've used in this framework. And one of those elements is the licensing regime, and that's what's set out here in Part 2. And it draws, as the Minister has said, quite heavily on the regime that we have in place for alcohol. And it provides, I guess, a template for reform in those other strands. So both here in Part 2 under the licensing regime, and indeed in Part 3, where we look at some of the regulatory responses that will be available to the authority, we see aspects that could be applied to those other strands, and gradually over time it will make sense for this House to pull those strands further and further together, actually converge them in a single framework that regulates all of those substances. So one of the things that, as speakers have mentioned, that the Part 2 does is provides the retail licence as an innovation from the Select Committee, and one that's certainly very, very valuable. And it's interesting that the Select Committee rejected only a few years earlier the prospect of using a licensing regime for tobacco retailers.
Sorry to interrupt the honourable member. The time has come for the dinner break. This debate is interrupted. I shall resume the chair at 7:30.